Hey, Dorislee, how are you?
Hi, Peter. I'm good. How are you?
Good. I want to welcome Dorislee Gilbert to Why We Do What We Do, the interview series that we do here at Marcys Law. Dorislee, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know you're busy. You're a mom of two little boys, and you're one of the moms who's blessed with the fact that your boys are going to school in person, though, these days.
I am. It's nice.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here today, though, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Now, just very quickly, in terms of bio, Dorislee is a Kentucky prosecutor, a former prosecutor from Kentucky. She has served crime victims in Louisville for 15 years as a prosecutor at the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. She used to be the chief of the appellate division. She was the deputy chief of the domestic violence and child abuse unit. She's handled more than 75 cases in the appeals court. She trained prosecutors during her years in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office throughout the state of Kentucky. She clerked with a Kentucky Supreme Court justice. She clerked with an Illinois appellate court justice. And in 2019, Dorislee was named Assistant Commonwealth Attorney of the Year at the Kentucky Prosecutor Conference. Dorislee, thank you so much for all the work that you do and for joining us today. We're really honored by your presence and your experience is something we're going to start to learn a little bit more about now. You are now the executive director of the Mary Byron Project, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. You have been an ally and supporter of Marcys Law in Kentucky. And as you know, Marcys Law is now on the ballot in Kentucky and people are already starting to vote. So I want to just ask you, as a former prosecutor, what is it that got you interested in Marcys Law? And why are you a supporter of Marcys Law as a former prosecutor?
Well, Peter, when I was at the prosecutor's office when Marcys Law was on the ballot a few years ago, and that's when I was first introduced to Marcys Law. I have long being a prosecutor for 15 years and working on cases that were very sensitive and involved the most egregious types of crimes committed against victims. I've long cared about victims and often felt their pain in the process of the court proceedings and not getting the results that they wanted, or feeling like sometimes the defendant's rights were the only rights that mattered and that they didn't have rights. So when I left the Commonwealth Attorney's Office and I came to the Mary Byron Project, where I do a lot of victim work, I really, and after Marcys Law was declared unconstitutional and is again on the ballot, was again being pushed through the legislature and again on the ballot, I really took a hard look at it and I said, you know, is this a good thing? What is going to happen here? And I looked at it with my experience from being a prosecutor for 15 years, and I thought about, you know, what does it require of prosecutors and what does it give to victims? And I've come to the belief that I think it is a great thing.
And tell me a little bit about your experience as a prosecutor and what it is about empowering victims in a way that Marcys Law does empower victims that will help prosecutors and would have helped you even more to do what you did as a prosecutor, the way you used to work with victims really from the very beginning of the process.
Well, what you mentioned there at the end is so true. I was trained this way, and I trained other prosecutors that I mentored this way, that it was important to connect with the victim early on in the case. And it was important to do that for a lot of reasons, to explain to them the process so that they have a realistic view of how long things are going to happen or take, and how long what might actually happen, as opposed to what they think might happen. How things like parole eligibility and probation eligibility matter and make a difference about what a final sentence might be, how the rules of court might affect what evidence comes in, and how what they think should happen and what the jury should know might not be what they need to know. And those things are so important, you know, along with making sure you have current contact information with the victim, making sure they know how to register with VINE. That's victim information and notification every day. It's a automated software that allows subscribers to be notified of certain events, or when an inmate is removed or released from custody or moved in custody. And so it was important to me to make sure that they knew all of these things at a meeting in the beginning or a phone call in the beginning, and also to lay out things like the roles of the people. Like, I represented the state, I didn't represent the victim, but I cared what they wanted to see happen. I wanted to give them an opportunity to express their concerns, ask their questions, give their opinions. But when it ultimately came down to it, I would be the decision maker in the case. And I would do what I thought was just and fair, given all the circumstances and my knowledge of the law in the case. And sitting down with the victim and explaining those things to them was so valuable early on in the process, because what happens is victims develop a sort of trust for you at that point. And when you call them later and you say, I think we need to talk about a plea agreement, or I think we need to try this case, they're more willing to listen and they understand why. And they are part of that process. It helps with their healing, to involve victims from the beginning, to lay out the expectations from the beginning and what might really happen in the system, because so many people, their only exposure to the criminal justice system is what they see on TV or what they heard about in some other state, and it's different everywhere. And so for them to hear from someone who's actually doing the work, what might really happen, helps them be able to not have this false sense of, this is all going to be over, I'm going to be healed, I'm going to feel better from this terrible trauma when this is over, because this is going to happen. Instead, they know that it might be uncertain and that they need to, that this is going to be a part of the healing, but they also need to trust the prosecutor to do what's going to happen there, and to focus on themselves. They've got a million other things going on in their lives. Some of them are planning funerals for loved ones. Some of them are recovering from very bad injuries. And so they've got other things that they need to focus their efforts on. And so it's important to give them the resources to contact you and to be in touch with you and for them to be part of the process. And I think that Marcys Law, all the prosecutors I work with were already doing that. We're doing all those things. We're notifying them if there was an event or a date coming up. And I think Marcys Law gives that constitutional force. It says what these prosecutors are already doing, we're going to say the Constitution supports that and requires that. Of course, it requires and gives more things too. And I know we're going to talk about those, Peter.
Yeah, and so that's a pretty interesting point, a very important point that you bring about with respect to your job as a prosecutor and how that works with Marcys Law. Marcys Law would not have impacted your discretion on what to do with a case and your strategy as a prosecutor on what to do with a case, whether it was to resolve it short of trial by some sort of disposition or to go to trial. Marcys Law gives the victims a voice and a constitutional voice, but what we usually say is it does not give the victim a veto over how a case is going to be handled by a prosecutor. And I think that's important. What do you think about that with respect to what prosecutors?
Absolutely. And I think that, by requiring that or encouraging and giving the right to that involvement in the process, there's so many ways that helps the prosecutor in exercising that discretion wisely and making that decision wisely. I can't tell you how many cases, where having contact with the victim and knowing early on prevented unnecessary delay in a case, because I was always able to locate them if I needed more information. Sometimes they were able to give me, other names of other witnesses or leads that we should be looking at to follow in a case. And so it helps the prosecution also. Obviously it's empowering for the victim to have that voice, to be part of the conversation. And I think that is already happening so much. And as you mentioned, Marcys Law doesn't change the fact that the prosecutor is making the decision. It empowers the victim with a constitutional right to participate.
Yeah, and the constitutional right and the constitutional voice that a victim has. You had a case within the past year or so in your role at the Mary Byron Project that you and I were talking about with a domestic violence victim that was before the court, and the defendant was looking to have his bail reviewed. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I can. And so this is the place where I think Marcys Law makes change to what's happening already. I was working with this victim in a criminal case, And I was not the prosecutor on this case. I was just representing her interest. And I appeared with her in court at a hearing where the defendant was asking for bail relief. And he was also accusing her of committing a crime and asking to have his case dismissed for that reason. And the judge told me that under Kentucky law, the victim didn't have a right to be heard or to be represented by counsel. And he was right. That was true. But Marcys Law would change that the victim would have a right to be heard at that hearing and to be represented by counsel at that hearing.
And one of the important things that Marcys Law does too is give victims a constitutional right to be notified as well as to be heard. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth when we talk about Mary Byron and her story, which is eerily similar to Marcy Nicholas's story. But one of the things that we talked about was not just court proceedings where victims have to be notified, but also non-court proceedings. And this is something that is there was a big deal pretty recently in the Commonwealth of Kentucky with respect to pardons. And I know you had a case yourself that would have been impacted by that. If you could tell us about that.
Sure. Before I left the prosecutor's office, probably the last 4 or 5 years that I was there, I worked with a victim and her family very closely in a case that had been tried more than a decade earlier when the victim was a child. She was 5 or 6, I think, when the crimes happened. It was very terrible sexual abuse, sexual assault of her by someone who was like a family member. And for years, he was trying to get that conviction overturned. He didn't want to be in prison for the rest of his life. And it was going through the court system. And this last time, we battled for years through the courts. The victim was involved and testified in court and did all of these, was part of the conversation, expressed her concerns and all of that. And the judge reviewed everything. It went up to the court, to a higher court, I think the Court of Appeals, although I don't remember which court it was, but there was a higher court that reviewed it. And it was all, his conviction was upheld. It was affirmed. It said, you know what, there was enough evidence. This jury was convinced. This jury thought this was the appropriate punishment. The judge was convinced and thought that at the time. And then less than a year later, without any notice to the victim, the governor pardoned him. And if Marcys Law had been around, she would have been invited to be heard. She would have had an opportunity to participate, to give her opinion about the pardon. And it might not have changed what the governor did. A victim being heard in court or in pardon proceedings might not change the ultimate decision. It might, though. And most of all, it will allow the victim to be empowered to have that moment in the court or in the pardon proceedings to give their voice, to say, I was hurt by this, and this is how it hurt me, and you need to consider these things when you're deciding what should happen.
Yeah, and one other thing that we talk about with Marcys Law in giving meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights to victims is that that victims' rights and constitutional rights specifically are not a zero-sum game. And by that I mean, when we grant constitutional rights to victims through Marcys Law, that doesn't take away any of the constitutional rights of the accused.
Absolutely.
And I think that's important. And I think it's one of the things that you and I talked about was, the pursuit of justice as prosecutors. I'm a former prosecutor myself. And that means justice for all, and that constitutional rights of defendants are to be taken just as seriously, no matter what laws are passed, and any law that's passed does not take those rights away. And one misconception I think that goes around in Kentucky right now that we should probably talk about is the whole idea of the stand your ground laws and the Castle Doctrine. Could you tell us a little bit about the stand your ground laws and Marcys Law and how that does or does not impact what happens in a situation like that?
Sure. So I've heard some people talk about they're concerned about Marcys Law because they think if somebody was breaking into their house and they reacted to protect their property and their family by, let's say, shooting the person that was breaking into their house, they're concerned that somehow Marcys Law would let that person, the burglar, have more rights somehow. And I think that that's based on maybe a misunderstanding of how the law works. In Kentucky, we do have what we call the castle doctrine. And basically that gives anyone the right to protect their property, their home, their family, if someone is intruding on it unlawfully. So if someone is breaking into your home, you have the right to protect your family and your home. And when you do that, you're not going to be charged with a crime. That's the point of the castle doctrine. You were justified in what you were doing because they were committing the wrongdoing. So Marcy's Law doesn't make the burglar not a burglar still. The burglar would still be the burglar. They would still be the one who committed the crime in that circumstance. And as the law stands currently, only the burglar has constitutional rights related to that criminal prosecution. Marcy's Law would give the homeowner, the victim, constitutional rights in the prosecution of the burglar, who was the only one there who committed any wrongdoing.
Well, that's good. I want to thank you for clearing that up. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is your current position at the Mary Byron Project, because it is. We talked before about how it is similar. The story that started the Mary Byron Project is similar to the story the tragedy that started Marcys Law in 1983. As you're very familiar with Marcys Law, Marsy Nicholas was murdered after being stalked by her ex-boyfriend. And it was a week later or so, as her brother, Dr. Henry Nicholas, who started Marcys Law and has put so much of his professional time and resources into making Marcys Law a reality throughout the country. He and his mom and Marcy's mom were walking into a grocery store after just visiting Marcy's grave, and were confronted by Marcy's killer. And they had no idea that killer was even out on bail. And they were wondering and questioned how could a system work like that? And Dr. Nicholas didn't just ask that question. He actually made a commitment to changing the system and to working on behalf of not just his sister, but victims throughout the country. And it's been incredible, the work that he has done and the work that Marcys Law has done. And one of the things that's been great about it that I've seen is all of the other incredible victims' rights organizations that are doing such great work on behalf of victims, one of them being the Mary Byron Project. Sadly, these stories and what usually starts such a beautiful, wonderful thing like Marcys Law or the Mary Byron Project, they start from a tragedy. Mm-hmm. And if you could tell us a little bit about the Mary Byron story and how that happened.
Sure. Mary was, she turned 21 years old on December 6, 1993. And that day she went to work. It was a day when things in her life had been a little bit crazy of recent times. She had been she had been raped and assaulted by an ex-boyfriend, and she had, police had been called, and that was reported, and they arrested him, and he was in jail. And so now it was her 21st birthday, and she thought, you know what? It's time to look forward in my life. It's time to look to the future. And I'm not scared because I know the person who hurt me so badly is in jail. Her family was calling every day to make sure that he was still in jail. But somehow he was out of jail and they didn't know. And he armed himself with a firearm. He knew where Mary worked. He went to her workplace. He waited in the parking lot. And when she left work that night carrying birthday balloons, he shot and killed her. And it, was just a devastating, awful crime for her family to have experienced. This man had been in their home, and they had, he had cared for their daughter, they thought, and then these things happened, and they just didn't understand. He was supposed to be in jail. He was supposed to be in jail. And his bail had been posted, and they didn't know. And so the community here in Louisville was outraged as well. And people kept asking, why didn't they know he was out on bail? Couldn't somebody tell them? I mean, she might have taken different precautions. She knew he was dangerous. She might have lived that night. And what happened here locally is some tech entrepreneurs created what I talked about earlier, Vine, this notification system. And that was launched a year after Mary died. And then it's used almost nationwide now. And a few years later, the people who created that said, you know, what happened to Mary was so tragic, and she didn't have the chance to fulfill her potential. And we need to do more to prevent that from happening to other people. And we can do that in Mary's name, to kind of leave this legacy for Mary that was stolen from her. And they created the Mary Byron Project. And for 20 years, we've been, you know, leaders in helping victims be protected and be safe, and in stopping intimate partner violence.
So the creators of Vine, and Vine is the Victim Information Notification Everyday System. And the creators of Vine were inspired by the story that you just told. Mm-hmm. And they saw a wrong that they wanted to see if they could put their resources behind, much like Dr. Nicholas did, and much like Dr. Nicholas continues to do. It really is an incredible story. And then that same team that started Vine, they were the ones that started the Mary Byron Project.
They were. And Peter, if I could tell you a little bit about what we're doing.
Yeah, I'd like to know, because I know you guys do a lot in, which is right in your wheelhouse, with appellate advocacy on behalf of victims, especially with respect to intimate partner violence. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing on that?
Absolutely. So we represent victims of intimate partner violence in appeals related to the intimate partner violence. So sometimes they are not protected by the courts. They went to the courts for some sort of assistance or protection, or for custody of their children or something like that. And instead they weren't given that. And they want to ask another court to look at it and give them the relief they sought. And so we represent them through that. Sometimes we represent them when they were protected by the court and the perpetrator appeals, either because he thinks he was denied justice, or sometimes because he wants to continue manipulating and intimidating the victim. And so we're there for that. We also do a lot of consultations with victims and with attorneys and prosecutors handling cases involving intimate partner violence. And we do training for justice system professionals like lawyers and police officers and court staff, to kind of give them a better trauma-informed outlook about intimate partner violence cases, to help them better utilize the law to protect survivors and to help people continue to be survivors of intimate partner violence, unlike Mary, who tragically did not survive intimate partner violence. What we know is that victims of intimate partner violence in particular are at high risk of marginalization through the process, of being unheard during the process, the criminal justice or the civil justice process, because there are so many stereotypes about intimate partner violence. And so our work is designed to help victims navigate through the system, and to help the system better protect them and secure them and serve them. And so if Marcys Law is adopted in Kentucky, if it becomes the law, if it becomes part of the Constitution in Kentucky, we think that will just further assist our efforts to help victims maneuver this system that they don't want to be in, that nobody wants to be in it, you know. And when you come to the criminal justice system, unless you're a professional working there, you come there involuntarily. And because the most awful, terrible thing has happened in your life, and at the bare basics, you should be allowed, for the people deciding what happens, to hear what you have to say.
And intimate partner violence in particular, you have an expertise in it from your time in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, being the Deputy Chief of the Child Abuse Unit. The Mary Byron Project is obviously very blessed to have you in the position that you're in. But the tough thing I remember reading about Mary's story, and it's not unlike a lot of people who are in domestic violence situations, is she felt safe. She had confided in her last appointment that night was her aunt.
Mhm.
And she confided in her that she finally felt safe because her perpetrator was in jail.
Absolutely.
And little did she know that her perpetrator was actually outside waiting for her.
Mhm.
And when she was warming up her car, that's when he shot her. I think he shot her 7 times at point blank range in the head and the body.
Really heartbreaking story. I mean, the creation of Vine out of that has been just really an amazing thing. Like I said, it's used almost all across the nation, and it really has helped. We believe it has saved people's lives. I mean, even Mary's family, or Marcy's family, I'm sorry, Marcy's family, if Vine had been used then, would have known that he was released from custody, and they wouldn't have been surprised to find him, you know, there at the store. I think is that where they saw him at. You know, it's really done important things, and Vine, I think, will be an instrumental, it has been an instrumental part of victims being notified about things that are going on in the criminal justice system. And I think it will continue to be after Marcy's Law. And it makes so many of those notifications automatic, and so much of that it just helps provide a sense of knowing what's going on, and helps the victim feel protected. Sometimes the process goes on forever. You know this, Peter, you were a prosecutor. Sometimes the prosecution takes a really long time to finish, and there are these long gaps where victims are concerned for their safety, or they wonder what's going on, and just knowing what the next date is, or when to look for something to happen, is a little bit of comfort. And knowing that you'll be notified if there's a release from custody is some comfort.
Yeah, it takes the mystery out of a lot of it, and that's, like you said, is really some of the daunting part of the daunting experience of becoming a victim in the criminal justice system. It's a brand new world to navigate, on top of all the stress that goes hand in hand with it, and on top of all the stress, like you said, in the life that was just altered. Some people are now planning funerals. Other people are trying to plan safe places to live, and on top of that altered life, they now have to face this mysterious system that's not necessarily too easy to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
So missions like Marcys Law and the Mary Byron Project that work really hand in hand together to support each other. That's the great thing about the victims' rights community, is how these missions are complementary. They support each other, and they end up empowering victims in a way that they've never been empowered before, with meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to thank you for your voice and how supportive you've been of Marcys Law as a former prosecutor, and make sure that you go out and vote, and tell all your friends to go out and vote.
I already voted, Peter, but yes, everyone needs to go out and vote.
And thank you so much for joining us today and taking some time from your busy day. And we wish you the best of luck with the Mary Byron Project, and we're always here to help you, as you have always been there to help us. So I appreciate it, Dorislee.
Thanks, Peter.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks.